My name is Elena Boltuța, and I work mainly on 13th century theories of cognition and metaphysics. My side project now is working on naturalizing intentionality. And my main project now is working with Yael Kedar and Jara Han on a project on Roger Bacon's mathematics and epistemology. So this is it. It wasn't that much. Yeah, and if you want to read, I do have some slight connections with Bacon. I just edited a collected volume a few years ago, and Mattia Mantovani and Lucas Lichka, who are here, both of them, wrote papers that tackle Roger Bacon. So I'm not as foreign to the field as you might think. And that's it. Should I go to introducing Daryl Rothkin? Are we all? Can we start? Okay, great. So, Darrel, it's time for you to shine. He's, as you well know, he's a historian of science and philosophy, and he specializes in the history of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern astrology from 1250 to 1800s. Kind of like the opposite of someone who works just on the 13th century, but yeah. His work focuses on astrology's relationships with science, theology, and magic. And one of the central questions, research questions that he's tackling is the conceptual and historical place of astrology in pre-modern Aristotelian Ptolemaic understanding of nature. And his goal is that by analyzing the teaching patterns employed in pre-modern universities to reveal the patterns of how astrology was marginalized and removed from the map of legitimate knowledge and practices during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. He's currently teaching at the Ca' Foscari University in Venice, and he's part of the Pietro Amodeo's ERC research group, Early Modern Cosmology. He's also looking for accommodation in Venice, so if anyone can help him. About his list of publications, which is quite extensive, I will only mention the first volume of his first monograph, which is entitled Medieval Structures, 1250 to 1500, Conceptual, Institutional, Socio-Political, Religious, and Cultural. It was published in 2019 with Springer. And today he will give a talk on Roger Bacon's mathematics, Perspectiva, and astrology, the Unnamed Master Revisited. I would like to tell you that after Darrell gives his presentation, there will be time for questions. And for questions, please feel free to either use the raise hand option or the chat. Thank you, and let's have fun.
Great. Thank you, Elena, for the lovely and gracious introduction. I hope everybody can see this slideshow. Okay. Astrology is a significant feature in a range of Roger Bacon's writings and in his vision of the world overall. I will focus here primarily on the opera Tria and related works. In this talk, I will first describe how astrology was configured within his vision of the sciences, focusing in particular on his views of mathematics and perspectiva in relation to astrology. In the second part, and within this context, I will readdress the question of the so-called unnamed master in Bacon's Opus Tertium, and precisely in relation to his views on mathematics, perspectiva, and astrology. In so doing, I will describe in some detail Bacon's vision of a deeply mathematicized, astrologizing Aristotelian natural philosophy, with its geometrical optical model of celestial influences within a Ptolemaic cosmographic framework. Perforce, I must leave out much more on Bacon's astrology than I can discuss here in a talk of reasonable length. Those who would like more detail should refer to volume 1 of my monograph, Sapientia Astrologica, about 1/4 of which is devoted to Bacon. I would like to begin this talk by locating astrology within Bacon's broader map of knowledge, specifically in relation to mathematics. In the Opus Maius, toward the beginning of Book 4, Roger describes how he understands the place of mathematics within his broader map of knowledge and some of its subdivisions. The first part of Opus Maius 4, entitled The Utility of Mathematics in Natural Philosophy, is clearly structured. The passage of interest on pages 109 to 111 of Bridges' edition directly follows a discussion where Bacon shows by authority and by reason why every science requires mathematics. Bacon begins with a characteristically strong claim. It is impossible for the things of this world to be known unless mathematics is known. He immediately begins justifying this universal claim by turning to the science of the stars. For the celestial bodies are certain to everyone because there are two great mathematical sciences concerning them, namely Astrologia Speculativa and Astrologia Practica. The first contemplates the quantities of all things that are in the heavens and everything that is reduced to quantity, both discrete and continuous quantity, for it certifies the number of the heavens and of the stars, whose quantity can be grasped by instruments, and all of their figures and their magnitudes and altitudes from the earth, and their thickness and number, magnitude and smallness, the rising and setting of the signs of the stars, and the motion of both the heavens and the stars, and the quantities and varieties of eclipses. Then it descends to the quantity and shape of the habitable world, and of all its large parts, which are called climata, and it shows the diversity of horizons and of days and nights corresponding to individual climates. These things then are determined here, and much is joined to them. In the first division of Astrologia Speculativa, Roger straightforwardly describes the content and aim of what we call mathematical astronomy. In the second part, he describes some of the basic divisions of mathematical geography. Roger then descends to the practical level. But Astrologia Practica descends to this, that for every hour we would know the location of the planets and stars and their aspects and relative positions and everything which is periodic among celestial bodies. And it descends to those things that come to be in the air, of which sort are comets and rainbows and other periodic things there, in order that we know their locations and altitudes and magnitudes and shapes and many things which it ought to consider in these matters. And these all come to be through instruments fitted to these ends, and by tables and by canons, that is, rules devised for confirming these things. Let us stop here momentarily and in mid-sentence to note that this first part of practical astrologia concerns the knowledge of where the planets and stars are at every hour of every day and of certain meteorological phenomena, and that this knowledge is attained with the help of certain unspecified instruments. We are thus still well within the realm of astronomy proper, but as particularized for specific times. The second part of Astrologia Practica continues thus: so that the way is prepared for judgments or interpretations, which can be made in accordance with the power of philosophy, not only in the realm of natural things, but in those which take their inclination from nature and freely follow the celestial disposition. Not only is the way prepared for judgments, judicia, of the present, past, and future, but for amazing works, in order that everything favorable for this world may be promoted and what is adverse repressed, usefully and magnificently. These things are not in doubt, for the patriarchs and the prophets have confirmed these and other things from the beginning of the world, and Aristotle renewed the confirmation of the ancients and brought it into the light. And all wise men agree in this in great matters, and experience teaches it. There will be an exposition of these things in their place. Nec sunt haec dubia, Bacon proclaims, adducing the support of authority, both religious and secular, and experience. And I should say that these translations are all mine. After showing how Roger configured astrology within the science of the stars, and how he distinguishes what we call astronomy from what we call astrology, both of which he calls astrologia in this programmatic passage, I will now indicate how he further articulates what we call astrology itself, to which he had just alluded. Here I will treat his explicit configuration of astrology within the mathematical disciplines in the introduction to his important edition of the slightly later Secretum Secretorum, and especially its bifurcation into an interpretive knowledge-based part, which he calls judiciaria, and an operative, or what we would call magical or technological part, which he calls operativa, that is, concerned with acting in the world. After introducing the distinction between true and false mathematics within the context of divination and astrology, a topic to which we shall return shortly, Roger discusses astrology's configuration among the true mathematical disciplines. And this Mathematica contains 4 sciences, namely geometry, arithmetic, music, and astrologia, under which astrologia, astronomia, judiciaria, and operativa are contained in a common term. We can see clearly here that the 4 scientiae contained within true mathematics are the 4 normal disciplines of the quadrivium, namely geometry, arithmetic, music, and the science of the stars. More interesting for our purposes is that after normatively configuring the science of the stars within the mathematical disciplines, Roger further distinguishes astrologia into 2 parts. He refers to the first as astronomia judiciaria, which I will neutrally and loosely translate here as the judicial or interpretive part of the science of the stars, and the second as astronomia operativa, or the operative part of the science of the stars. As it turns out, the latter is concerned with 2 different practices that Roger refers to as the works and words of wisdom, the opera et verba sapientiae, namely making works, opera, primarily talismans, or uttering potent and powerful words, verba, in order to move or affect things in the world. We would normally call both of these magical practices, but Roger himself most certainly would not do so, as we will see in a moment. I have come to find that Roger's distinction here is extremely useful in understanding the medieval map of knowledge regarding what we call both astrology and magic. Although this phrasing appears in Roger's introduction to his slightly later edition of the Secretum Secretorum, it concisely and precisely captures structures he expounds at much greater length in the 3 opera composed for Pope Clement IV. With these basic conceptual structures in mind, let us now turn to Roger's defense of astrological interpretations for judgments, Judicia Astronomiae, in Opus Maius Book 4. My focus here will primarily be on the Judiciaria side of the Judiciaria Operativa distinction, although the Operativa side is also very interesting, especially the making of talismans, which we will undoubtedly learn more about in Nicola's talk in March. Roger's usage here can also help us to more properly historicize the more modern natural judicial astrology distinction, which is nowhere apparent in Roger's work and should not be imposed thereon, at least not without good reasons. In Opus Maius 4, on pages 238 to 267 of Bridges' edition, Roger begins a new section that is centrally concerned, first, with removing all doubts and concerns about mathematics, its utility for theology. Given the centrality of mathematics to his overall natural philosophy, and of philosophy's centrality to theology, Roger devotes significant attention to defending mathematics' weakest because most controversial link, namely what he calls the judgments of the science of the stars, Judicia Astronomiae, which we normally call astrology. Roger's attention to these issues is fully justified within his system of thought, and it is very interesting for our purposes. To defend astrological judgments or interpretations, Roger begins by introducing an essential, characteristic, and utterly fundamental distinction for him between true and false mathematics, his terminology, which leads into a rich discussion of both astrology and what he explicitly calls magic. Having made clear how Mathematica is necessary for both divine and human wisdom, it is also necessary for certifying what went before, namely, that certain complaints against it, mathematics, be removed, and that certain sayings of the saints be set out so that every doubt is destroyed concerning the utility of mathematics. That respect in which mathematics is primarily attacked is due to astrological judgments. Roger immediately identifies mathematics' weakest link, and thereby the source of its attacks, as what he calls Judicia Astronomiae. Roger begins by attacking ignorant theologians who, in his view, created the problem in the first place due to their systematic misunderstandings. Here Roger offers a quasi-historical account of the devolution of knowledge. Therefore, since the contention of the many people ignorant of the power of philosophy and its great utility for theology, and the considerations of those who reprove the mathematici, both relatively and absolutely, impede the study of wisdom and gravely harm it in this part. Therefore, I wish at present to verify their intent, expect their infamia from true mathematics. Because mathematics has power for philosophy and great utility for theology, it must be defended and its bad reputation removed by a process of reconceptualization. After putting forward the concept of true mathematics, Roger immediately and explicitly distinguishes it from false mathematics. He first discusses the statements of the saints and offers his interpretation of their intentions. Therefore, theologians have found many things uttered by the saints against the mathematici, and some of them, the theologians, because of their ignorance of true mathematics and false mathematics, do not know how to distinguish true from false, and therefore, as though by the authority of the saints, they blame true mathematics with the errors of the false. Due to their ignorance of the true nature of mathematics, certain theologians have confused true with false mathematics and thus mistakenly attacked the true kind by conflating the two and reproaching both. To set the record straight by properly distinguishing true from false mathematics, Bacon introduces an etymological argument on which he places great weight, but which changed diametrically over time. For the word for true mathematics is written with an aspirated T, and from this the noun mathesis with the middle shortened is derived, which signifies knowledge. It is said to be derived from many authors or authorities. It is certainly from Greek, since matheo is the same verb as disco, I teach, is, and mathetis is discipulus, student, and mathesis, disciplina, teaching or body of knowledge. Whence, mathematica is disciplinalis scientia et doctrinalis, as Cassiodorus said. But the word for false mathematics is written without an aspiration and is asserted by the same authorities, and is from matesis with the middle lengthened, which denotes divination and derives etymologically either from mantos, which is more certain, or from mantia, which are both the same as divinatio, as Jerome says in the original of 9 Isaiah. Although the terminology for true and false mathematics is distinctive, it is also deceptively similar, boiling down to the difference between a t versus a th sound and a shortened or lengthened vowel quality with correspondingly different etymologies. True mathematics is thus derived from matheo, amathesis, and is pronounced with an aspirated T and a shortened vowel quality. It means learning and knowledge. False mathematics, on the other hand, derives from mantos or mantia and refers to divination. A further distinction here between true and false knowledge is also implied. Thus, divination as false knowledge or learning is decidedly negative for Roger, which was also the case for Thomas Aquinas, as I discuss elsewhere. As is well known, Bacon subsequently revised his analysis of this same etymology in his edition of the Secretum Secretorum, which he wrote at some point between 1270 and 1292. Despite the switched terminology with its correlative etymologies, however, the results of his later analysis were exactly the same, in that Roger still conceptually distinguished true from false mathematics in precisely the same manner. The weight of his concern thus falls much more heavily on the conceptual distinction than on the terminology with its respective etymology. To complete this brief initial etymological discussion, Roger makes another major point that he will return to often. In addition to divination or false knowledge, false mathematics is also closely associated with what he explicitly calls the magical art. In Roger's usage, what he explicitly calls magic and divination are always negative. But whatever the case is about this writing, this spelling, and its etymological derivation, false mathematics is nevertheless a magical art, and ars magica. For 5 species of the magical art are enumerated, namely mantike, which means divination, mathematica, which is mathematics or astrology, maleficium, which is doing harm, praestigium, which is illusions, and sortilegium, for the casting of lots, which is sometimes translated as sorcery. Therefore, false mathematics is the second part of the magical art. It usurps to itself a consideration of the celestial bodies deformed by characters, charms, conjurations, superstitious sacrifices, and various frauds. Roger here offers a 5-fold typology of the magical arts, adopting the structure from Hugh of St. Victor's Didascalicon. False mathematics is thus included integrally among the magical arts, as is mantike, or divination. They are all anathema, as Roger proceeds to discuss. Astrology, magic, and divination are thus all closely associated here, and we can begin to see how they are configured within Bacon's thought with respect to both his distinctive terminology and its underlying conceptual structures. Bacon then strongly asserts why this false magical mathematics is problematic, and in so doing indicates the main issues for a theologian. And it, mathematical magic, or magical and thus illegitimate astrology, posits, 1, that everything happens necessarily by the power of celestial configurations. 2, that nothing can go one way or another. 3, that nothing happens by chance or fortune. And 4, nothing by counsel. This false type of mathematics, that is, illegitimate magical astrology, both assumes and implies a deterministic structure of nature, in which everything happens by necessity in such a way that free will, chance, and human choice are wholly undermined. The terminology Roger uses, the implications of this view for free will in particular, both divine and human, had long made astrology suspect. Roger will discuss this subject at length in what follows in Opus Maius 4, and return to it repeatedly as a leitmotif, but I can go no further into these interesting matters here. Bacon completes this section by relating it back to and thus concluding the larger argument being addressed here, namely defending mathematics' value in relation to its dubious associations by some with astrological judgments. To do so, Roger defends true mathematics in the central and controversial realm of both individual and collective human affairs, where concerns about implications of necessity in nature and infallible astrological judgments are both successfully addressed. In the process, Roger provides us with valuable insight into his views on the roles of nativities and revolutions with both medical and political applications, and thus of practical astrology's profound utility in human affairs. As it turns out, Bacon also uses revolutions in the analysis of the history, i.e. the generation and corruption of the great world religions in terms of both great conjunctions and a series of 10 Saturn cycles. He primarily discusses elections, the choosing of astrologically propitious times in relation to making talismans, the opera sapientiae, but I cannot go further into these fascinating matters here in the interest of time. As far as I know, however, Roger does not use interrogations, the last of the 4 canonical types of astrological practice. Now that we have some idea of Roger Bacon's views of astrology's central place within his map of knowledge, I would like to reapproach the question of the so-called unnamed master in Roger's Opus Tertium. I will approach this reappraisal by asking a central question, namely, what is the intellectual relationship between two of the most important 13th century natural philosophers, Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon? More specifically, is Albert the unidentified object of Roger's spleen in the Opus Tertium? Currently leans quite heavily in the affirmative. The two most recent scholars to discuss this issue in any depth, Stuart Easton in 1952 and Jerry Hackett in 1980, both conclude that Albert is, in fact, the unnamed master. David Lindbergh, Paola Zambelli, Amanda Power in her recent biography, and now Nikolaus Egel in his new edition of the Opus Tertium push the scales even further in this direction. Nevertheless, and however plausible the attribution, we should keep the question open and take an approach that seems strangely neglected. Easton stated his desire to compare what Roger said about the unnamed master with the known facts of Albert's life and works, and this is surely the soundest approach. In practice, however, Easton focused almost exclusively on theological issues, dismissing the evidence of Albert's scientific writings on his final page. Hackett, on the other hand, did not compare the content of their ideas at all. He was content, rather, to show that the named attributions to Albert in Roger's works were similar to what was said of the unnamed master, and that, therefore, the unnamed master is Albert. Even if it were otherwise compelling, however, Hackett undercuts this argument on the final page of his essay, where he explicitly states that proper names in Roger's manuscripts are not particularly reliable. Fortunately, Roger's criticisms of the unnamed master are detailed enough to reconstruct his views on the subjects in question. Likewise, there is much relevant material by Albert. In fact, the content of Roger's criticism, on which we shall focus, the unnamed master's ignorance of Perspectiva, provides an excellent basis for comparison. Roger mentions the unnamed master in his Opus Tertium, the overall prolegomenon to his set of 3 works, addressed and sent to Pope Clement IV in 1266-67, which has recently received a valuable new edition by Nikolaus Egel. The main passages of criticism occur in chapter 11, where Roger discusses first mathematics and then Perspectiva, explicitly criticizing the unnamed master twice for his utter ignorance of Perspectiva. Here is the first criticism. And it is necessary that everything be known by this science, Perspectiva, because all the actions of things come to be in accordance with the multiplication of species and powers from the agents of this world acting on receptive matter. And the laws of multiplications of this sort are not known except by Perspectiva, and they are not treated anywhere else, since not only are actions common with regard to vision, but they are so for all the senses and in the entire system of the world, both in the heavens and on earth. But this science has not yet been taught in Paris, nor among the Latins, except twice at Oxford in England. And there are not 3 people who know its power. Therefore, he who made himself an authority, an auctor, and this is the first explicit criticism, about whom I spoke above, knew nothing of the power of this science, as appears in his books, because he did not compose a work. He did not compose a work on this science. He would have done so had he known it. nor does he say anything on this science in his other works. For our purposes, we should first note the somewhat detailed discussion of Perspectiva encountered before the criticism, and secondly, the clearly stated claims that the master, whoever he is, never wrote a treatise on Perspectiva, nor did he treat it at all in any of his other works. Since we do not, in fact, possess a separate treatise on Perspectiva by Albert, the attribution is supported, so its accuracy will stand or fall on the second point. If, in fact, there are no references at all to Perspectiva, as understood by Roger in Albert's extant works, then we shall be able to lend solid, albeit negative, evidence to his attribution as the unnamed master. Roger then provides references to his fuller treatments on Perspectiva, namely Opus Maius Book 5, a full treatise on Perspectiva, and a large part of Book 4, where he determined on the multiplication of species and the virtues of agents, which he took from the science of Perspectiva. And for this reason, because it is the highest and principal root of wisdom, both for philosophy and for theology, there is in these multiplications also unbounded beauty, and neither is Perspectiva nor any bit of philosophy able to be known without it. But he, and here we have the second criticism, who multiplied volumes ignores these roots, for he touches on none of them, and therefore it is certain that he is ignorant of natural things and everything concerning philosophy, and not only him, but the whole horde of philosophizers who err because of him. Albert certainly did write a lot, as any glance at his collected works reveals, so the comment about the unnamed master multiplying volumes could surely apply to him as well. Likewise could the comment about his great influence on students of philosophy. There can be no doubt of the plausibility in general of thinking that the unnamed master is Albert. This conclusion is further supported by the lack of other compelling candidates. Roger discusses his views on Perspectiva in greater detail in Opus Maius Book 4, and even more so in Book 5. I will focus on his concern with the places of the world and their importance in generation in Book 4. He states the main issue most clearly in a section entitled Geography. For the things of the world cannot be known except through knowledge of the places in which they are contained. For place is a principle of the generation of things, as Porphyry says, because the diversity of things corresponds to the diversity of places, and not only also of moral and scientific. We can verify this based on understanding the longitude and latitude of any place. For then we know under which stars each place is, and how far it is from the path of the sun and planets, and of which planets and signs the places receive dominion, which all make the diverse complexions of places. If they were known, one could know the complexions of everything in the world, and the natures and properties which they draw from the virtus of a place. Let's begin to unpack what Roger says here by turning to a section where he discusses on the nature of place. Complexions of the places of the world cannot be discovered unless a person knows the aforementioned laws of multiplications of species. Place is a principle of generation, as also a father is, as Porphyry says. And we see that everything is varied in accordance with the diverse places of the world. Roger then makes the picture more precise by providing the causal basis of his theory. But since the things of this world, which have been established in diverse places, however close they are, receive cones of diverse pyramids coming from the entire heavens opposite them, therefore unbounded diversity arises. For the cones of individual pyramids come to single points of the earth, and each point of the earth is the center of a new horizon. Here Roger begins to develop an analysis whereby natural things cannot be known except by their causes, namely the heavens, the luminaries and planets within the zodiac, which he places into a scientific framework informed by Perspectiva. Here he establishes the geometrical uniqueness of each point on Earth based on its unique angular relationship to the celestial situation, which is a central feature of his system. Roger then illustrates the significant implications of his analysis. And therefore, we see that two plants born at the same time from the earth without anything in between them, and therefore two twins in the womb of their mother, are allotted a difference of complexion so that afterward they would have diverse customs and they would pursue different arts and different occupations throughout their entire lives. And therefore the powers of the heavens and the stars produce everywhere things diverse in properties and natures, that is, in things generated by propagation. And when a child at birth is exposed to a new air, as to another world, then he receives cones of celestial pyramids with respect to his individual parts, and thus he receives new impressions which never leave, because what a new head grasps, it knows forever. And then the root complexion is confirmed, which always remains until the end of life, although the current complexion changes with every day. And it is this root complexion which the inclinations to customs and to sciences and to languages follow, and to whatever handiworks and occupations, and to every difference that we see in everyone. In this section, Roger shows the necessity of his doctrine, the multiplication of species, for understanding the complexions of things in the world, namely their characteristic qualitative nature. Celestial influences are fundamental, directly affecting both levels of a complexion, the root and the current. He also thereby provides the natural philosophy. He also thereby provides the natural philosophical foundations for nativities or natal astrology. Now that we have a firmer grasp of Roger's views on Perspectiva and their bearing on the criticism of the unnamed master, I will now more systematically describe the central feature of his model of action, what David Lindbergh calls pyramids of force. Roger emphasizes the importance of this pyramidal figure. And this is the figure which nature especially chooses in every multiplication and action, and not any pyramid, but that whose base is the surface of the agens, and whose cone falls on some point on the patiens, because thus the species can come from the entire surface of the agens to the individual points of the patiens through an infinite number of individual pyramids. He then describes the structure of how the agens acts. It is fitting that the multiplication comes to be spherically, for the agens multiplies itself equally on every side, and in accordance with every diameter and every difference of position, which are up, down, fore, aft, right, and left. Therefore, lines come forth from everywhere on all sides from an agens, just as from the center. This omnidirectional radiation, the multiplication of an agent species, is analyzed in terms of these pyramids for every point where its action is received. Once these pyramids of force are understood in the abstract, Roger can then show how his model accounts for celestial influences. In order to analyze accurately the pyramid of force resulting from any given celestial configuration, each of the planets must first be accurately located. Once a working theory of each planet's motion has been devised and hopefully verified by observation, then for convenience, tables may be constructed for their location at every hour of every day, as we saw in his discussion of practical astrology. This is critical because every planet, as an agens in Bacon's model, continuously emits an infinite number of rays in every direction. If each planet is accurately located for every time, its unique angular relationship to the center of the Earth can then be known. One must then be able to localize these planetary patterns of influence for particular places at particular times. In order to do so, the mathematical geographical framework must be added by accurately mapping the longitudes and latitudes of the Earth, and then calibrating them with the patterns established by mathematical astronomy. Then one may localize celestial influences within this essentially Ptolemaic cosmographic framework by means of the horizon, which is defined precisely and uniquely for its place by the relation of each point on the sphere of the Earth to its corresponding unique point on the heavenly sphere. Roger concludes, to every point of the Earth falls the cone of one pyramid made virtuous by the entire heaven. And these cones are diverse in nature, and the pyramids likewise, because they have different bases because of the differences of their horizons, since each point of the Earth is the center of its own horizon. It is only at this point, when the integrated mathematical, astronomical, and geographic framework has been constructed, namely when the abstract pyramids of force can be instantiated for a particular planetary configuration at a particular time for a particular place, then and only then can the astrologizing natural philosopher approach his or her proper question. The basic fourfold structure of planetary influences corresponds to these four questions. First, what is the qualitative nature of each planet? Second, what is the qualitative nature of each planet as modified by each sign of the zodiac? Third, what then is the qualitative nature of the figure of the heavens at any given time? That is, what is the qualitative relationship of each planet in each of their respective signs at a particular time in relation to each other? Finally, what is the qualitative nature of the celestial configuration in its unique angular relationship to each particular point on the sphere of the Earth? The fourth question relates directly to Roger's concern with place and thus fits squarely into the causal framework articulated here. The figure of the heavens at all times is related to every place in the world here below, irradiating it with its particular mix of planetary qualities at that time, and thus influencing and thereby informing its complexion. Then, since place is a principle of generation, this planetary configuration affects the complexion of every natural thing generated there. This omnidirectionally irradiating celestial configuration is described by a complex pattern of planetary pyramids of force, which collectively have a unique angular relationship to every point on Earth. This last angular relationship is important because whether the angles of incidence are perpendicular or oblique further conditions their degree of force. As I have now indicated, Roger Bacon is remarkably consistent in his analysis of our central theme, the variety of places in the world and their fundamental importance for understanding the complexions of naturally generated things. He uses the same causal analysis throughout, namely the multiplication of species, which for him is a geometrical optical model of action, planetary and otherwise, within a fundamentally Ptolemaic cosmographic framework composed of mathematical astronomy integrated with mathematical geography. That is, the very themes which informed his detailed criticism of the unnamed master. We are now ready to compare Roger's views with those by Albert. I will here examine an obvious work, a treatise entitled On the Nature of Place, De Natura Loci. It falls within the famous series of Albert's Aristotelian commentaries, filling a lacuna in Aristotle's system where no authentic work exists. Albert places it just after the Physics, De Generatione et Corruptione, and De Caelo, thus among Aristotle's core natural philosophical works, and it may be dated to circa 1251 to 1254, while Albert was at Cologne. Our first passage is the opening paragraph of the first chapter, entitled That It Is Proper in Natural Scientia to Know the Nature of Place. We will treat the nature of places, which comes from the relation of the place to the heavens. First, we will mention those things determined in the physics, for there it was proved that place is an active principle of generation, like the Father is. We thus immediately encounter the familiar view that the nature of place concerns the relationship of the heavens to the earth, and that place is a principle of generation. In a second passage, we get more detailed information. Therefore, from all of these things, it is sufficiently allowed that one ought to know the nature of place. Nor does the treatise in the physics suffice, for this reason, that it only verifies concerning place universally. Because of which those err who treat scientia naturalis and do not bring in anything about the diversity of places. They seek solace for their inexperience if they say that it is not fitting to inquire about this, for it does not suffice that this sort of diversity be treated in mathematical books, where which stars rise or fall in this or that manner above which places is treated, namely whether obliquely or on the perpendicular, and which of them neither rise nor set but are always apparent, or which appear and which rise and set sometimes. Because, although from these the location of the climata may be known, nevertheless the nature of places and the diversity of their complexions are not sufficiently known by means of these. Albert here indicates the necessity of mathematical astronomy and geography, but also their insufficiency in themselves for the natural philosopher. In chapter 5, Albert discusses the particularities of places. This passage provides material for a proper comparison. Moreover, if anyone wished to understand in particular all the natures and properties of particular places in water and air and on earth, he would know that there is not a point in them which does not have a special property from the power of the stars oriented towards the middle habitation of mixed things, namely the earth. For the circle of the horizon is varied in relation to each point of the habitation of animals and plants and stones, and the entire orientation of the heavens to the middle place of habitation is varied in relation to the variation of the horizon circle, from which cause their natures, properties, customs, actions, and species, which seem to be generated in the same perceptible place, are varied to such an extent that diverse properties and customs are attributed to twin seeds, both for brute animals and for men, from this different orientation. And this is reasonable because it has been learned that the heavens pour forth formative powers into everything that exists. Moreover, it mostly pours them forth by means of rays emitted by the lights of the stars. And therefore it follows that each pattern and angle of rays causes different powers in things below. There can be no doubt that Albert just provided exactly the same causal analysis as Roger did, and in much the same language. In fact, Albert has now introduced a geometrical optical model of celestial influences, where the different patterns of celestial rays striking different points on Earth cause different virtues in things below. He also uses the horizon to individuate the location of each and every place on Earth in relation to the celestial situation, just as Roger did, and for the very same reasons. The passage continues. Since, therefore, from a change of the horizon, it is necessary that the entire circle would be changed, and from the change of the circle, the entire configuration of the rays would be changed. And since each point of a habitation constitutes one special center of a horizon, it follows necessarily that each point of the habitation has special powers by which that which is located in it is informed. And this is the cause why no generated thing is found to be completely similar to something else in every detail of its properties. And this is locus properly, about which Porphyry says that it is one of the individuating features. A celestial configuration causes the qualitative power of the stars which are poured into things below. Moreover, not only is each particular place of a different property than another, but also each place in itself is made of different properties successively at different times. For this reason, that by means of the rise and fall of the stars above it, above the place in question, and the different relationship of these stars to each place, it is necessary for its properties to be varied. And this is why generated things are transformed by what contains them. Albert's causal analysis is thus exactly the same as Roger's, emphasizing each place's unique qualitative makeup, and that the nature of the influences changes over time. One last passage, and then I'll get to my conclusion. Because of which also those who are wise concerning the stars first diligently consider the celestial circle of each place. Then they proceed to consider the powers of the places as a second set of stars, and from these two joined together, they prognosticate about the nature of the thing generated. For the stars flow their powers in by means of something else, not without an intermediary, and they use a twofold medium for the influx of their powers, of which one is a ray and the second a containing place. And by means of these two, they, the wise astrologers, come to the matter of the generated thing, which the flowed-in virtues form and determine. Moreover, the variation of the star's location is the cause of the variation of the figure which the rays describe above the circle of the horizon. And this is the cause of the variation of the powers of places and of those things which are generated in places, and therefore it is necessary that a natural philosopher know these variations. Given this comparison, I think we must conclude that the contents of Albert's astrologizing Aristotelian natural philosophy discussed here could hardly be closer to Roger's, both conceptually and linguistically. Albert uses a geometrical optical model of celestial influences within a fundamentally Ptolemaic mathematical, astronomical, and geographical framework to explain the fundamental role of place in generation, precisely as Roger did. Perhaps we should conclude more accurately that central patterns in Roger Bacon's astrologizing Aristotelian natural philosophy bear an extraordinarily close resemblance to Albert's, considering that Albert wrote his relevant work over 10 years prior to Roger. One might even think that Roger completely took over the substance of Albert's work and simply refined it by adding Robert Grosseteste's notion of the multiplication of species. If Albert knew Grosseteste's work, he apparently decided not to embrace this characteristic feature of his analysis. In that case, Bacon seems to be asserting here, in effect, that ignorance of Perspectiva can be claimed for simply not using the multiplication of species, because this seems to be the only discernible difference between Albertus Magnus's and Roger Bacon's richly astrological analyses of place. We seem to have two options then. Either Roger intended the criticism to apply to Albert or he did not. If he did, it is ill-founded based on ignorance, bloody-mindedness, or both. If he did not, to whom was it meant to apply? Both options are problematic. The second would be better for Roger's scholarly reputation, but would leave a gaping hole in our knowledge. Other things being equal, we should choose it by the principle of interpretive charity. But where we can check other of Roger's claims against independent sources, we often find significant evidence of his equally ignorant and or bloody-minded assertions, as is well known, as in his well-known comments about Grosseteste and William of Moerbeke. Besides supporting the view that Roger meant the criticism for Albert, the positive weight of this evidence also happily requires no search for other suitable candidates. Further, the unfortunate impact of this evidence on Roger's already tarnished character is minimal, simply confirming what was already known. We may conclude then that Roger's criticism was probably intended to apply to Albert, even though it does not in fact apply to him, as we can judge from the independent evidence of Albert's scientific works, thus complicating the issue rather than settling it. Regardless, we now have a deeper understanding of the strikingly similar, intricately mathematicized, astrologizing Aristotelianisms of two of the most important and influential 13th century natural philosophers. I offer a much fuller version of this argument in Chapter 2 of Volume 1 of my monograph, for those who might be interested. Thank you very much for your attention.